The rain came down sideways, not the soft kind that smells like wet earth and wood smoke, the kind that makes people want to stay inside with something warm. This was the other kind, the kind that finds every gap between your collar and your neck, every unzipped inch, every place you forgot to button. The kind that turns a two-lane Texas highway into a mirror and makes the headlights of passing trucks bleed and smear across the asphalt like something wounded trying to move. Ethan Rowe sat on the metal bench at the Route 87 bus stop and watched the water run in sheets off the corrugated plastic overhang above him. The bench was cold enough to feel through 2 layers of denim. His sneakers had been soaked through for the better part of an hour. He'd been sitting there 47 minutes. He knew this precisely because he'd checked his phone 47 times once per minute like a compulsion he couldn't stop, even though he understood perfectly well that checking wouldn't make the bus arrive faster. The app showed the 9:15 still on the schedule. Still coming. 12 minutes out, then 11, then 10. He was 14 years old. He was alone. And tucked inside the inner pocket of his jacket, folded into a tight rectangle and pressed flat against his chest, were the adoption papers. Not a copy, the originals. His caseworker, a soft-spoken woman named Marlene Shaw, who smelled like lavender hand cream and always apologized when she delivered bad news, which was often had driven them out to the Callaway group home herself that afternoon. She'd slid them across the kitchen table with a careful smile and said the Callaways were ready. The hearing had been approved. He just needed to be on the 9:15 to Amarillo, and they'd meet him at the station. Ethan had looked at the papers for a long time before picking them up. He'd learned not to reach too fast for things. Reaching fast got you disappointed fast, and disappointment in his world tended to arrive with physical weight, something that settled in the chest and didn't leave for weeks. But he'd picked them up. He'd folded them carefully. He'd pressed them against his chest. The Callaways were real people. He'd spoken with them twice on video call. Carl Callaway ran a small engine repair shop outside Amarillo. His wife Martha taught 4th grade. They had a dog named Biscuit in a vegetable garden that Carl described with the kind of embarrassing enthusiasm that made something in Ethan's chest do a thing it didn't usually do. A small, involuntary clench like a fist tightening around something fragile. They had a bedroom with a window that faced east. Martha had mentioned that specifically. Morning light, she'd said. I thought you might like morning light. He'd been in 11 foster homes across 12 years. He'd learned which families wanted a helper, which wanted a project, which wanted to feel good about themselves for 6 months before the reality of an actual damaged child made the project less appealing. He'd learned the specific tone of voice adults used when they'd already decided but hadn't yet worked up the nerve to make the call. He'd learned to pack fast and keep his bag near the door. But the Callaways had called him back twice, and Martha had remembered he mentioned liking astronomy. Mentioned it in passing almost as an accident. On their second call, she'd shown him the telescope Carl had set up in the backyard. Just in case, she'd said, no pressure. Ethan was not a boy given to sentimentality. 12 years of the system had burned most of that out of him before he was old enough to name what he was losing. But he'd looked at that telescope on the small screen of his borrowed phone and felt something crack open in his sternum. Slow, irreversible. Like ice in March. He wanted to go. He wanted it with a fierceness that scared him, because wanting things that hard was a liability in his world. He knew that. His heart didn't care. 9 minutes on the app, he checked again. The highway stretched out in both directions into absolute darkness, broken only by the occasional smear of headlights from passing trucks. No other buildings visible. Just the 2-lane road, the flat Texas scrubland, on either side a billboard for a car dealership half a mile back, and across the highway, a gravel pull-off where a rusted chain-link fence marked the edge of what had once been some kind of commercial property. Weeds had grown through and around the chain links over the years, half obscuring whatever was behind it. An abandoned storage lot maybe, long dead. Ethan wasn't paying much attention to the other side of the road. He was watching the bus app trying to calculate whether the storm would slow the route when the sound reached him. Not rain, not highway noise. A child's voice, high and jagged, cut off almost immediately the way sound gets cut off when something clamps over a mouth. He looked up. It took him a moment to understand what he was seeing through the dark and the rain. The gravel pull-off across the highway, the rusted fence, and just inside the reach of a single working streetlight, the bulb yellow and buzzing and half obscured by rain, a white cargo van with its side door open. A large man in a dark jacket and a small girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. She was wearing a yellow rain slicker, the hood knocked back so her dark hair was plastered flat against her face by the rain. She was pulling against the man's grip with everything she had, both arms locked rigid, her whole body wrenched sideways, her shoes slipping and dragging on the wet gravel. The man was very large, one hand locked around her upper arm, the other pressed over her mouth. For 3 seconds, Ethan sat absolutely still. His brain ran the calculation it always ran, the survival calculation, the one that 12 years of institutional living had sharpened to a precise and automatic edge. One man adult large, probably 180 or more. One boy 14, lean no training. Highway, rain, night, no witnesses. A bus arriving in 8 minutes that would take him to a bedroom with morning light and a telescope in the backyard. Stay put. The number came up the same every time. Stay put. The girl made the sound again, muffled this time, trapped against that large hand, barely audible over the rain. But it reached him. The frequency of a child who knows exactly how much danger she is in and is trying to scream through the thing that won't let her. Ethan had heard that frequency before. Not from outside, from inside. A long time ago in a house he didn't live in anymore when he was small enough that screaming seemed like it might help. He stood up. He crossed the highway at a run. He didn't think about it. The numbers were still running in his head, still coming up. Wrong, still telling him the odds were catastrophic. He ran anyway. Across the asphalt into the headlight glare of a passing truck that blasted its horn. Across the other lane, into the gravel of the pull-off, his soaked sneakers sliding as he hit the loose surface. He hit the man from the side with everything he had. It wasn't much. He knew that even as he did it. He got one shoulder into the man's ribs and managed to break the grip on the girl's arm. Felt himself immediately grabbed and shoved hard enough to take him off his feet. He hit the gravel on his back with the full weight of the fall and lost his breath completely. The cold, wet gravel pressed through his jacket. Rain hit his upturned face. He could see the buzzing yellow streetlight directly above him. He heard the girl scramble away, the crunch of gravel, the slap of shoes on wet ground. The girl was running. The man's voice came from above him, low, not panicked, annoyed. "Kid, walk away from this." Ethan got to his feet. His ribs were reporting something urgent. His breath was still not operating at full capacity. The man was standing between him and the van now. Broad shoulders, dark jacket with no insignia. A face that was not unkind but was completely without expression. Professional in a way that was worse than anger would have been. The van's side door was still open. From somewhere in the dark past the reach of the streetlight, he could hear the girl still moving, still running, still going. "I said walk away. This isn't your problem." "She didn't want to go with you." Ethan's voice came out steadier than he expected. He was aware somewhere below the surface that he was very scared. It wasn't showing, he'd learned that early. How to keep fear below the face contained pressurized. 11 homes, 12 years. He'd had a lot of practice. The man looked at him for a moment, long enough that something shifted in the flat expression. Not anger, something closer to assessment, recalibration. Last time, the man sighed quietly and took one step forward. Then the sound came. It came from the highway first, a low, heavy thunder building from the north through the rain growing fast. Not trucks, not the blurred, continuous sound of highway traffic. Something rhythmic. Multiple sources, getting louder by the second. 3 headlights appeared in the rain. They came down Route 87 at a pace that suggested neither hurry nor indifference. The kind of pace that understood its own weight. 3 Harley-Davidson motorcycles, heavy and dark, their engines a synchronized low rumble that Ethan felt in his sternum more than he heard with his ears. They slowed as they reached the gravel pull-off and turned in without hesitation. Their headlights swept the space and found with the precision of people who know exactly what they're looking for, the man, the van, the boy, and the girl who had made it to the far edge of the lot and was crouched against the fence in the dark. The 3 bikes stopped in a loose triangle, engines idling. Nobody got off immediately. They just sat there. 3 men on 3 machines in the rain. The headlights pinned the scene like something caught. Nobody spoke. The man in the dark jacket looked at the three motorcycles for a long count of four. Ethan watched him run his own calculation. The fundamental mathematics were the same as Ethan's, but with different inputs, and the answer was apparently the same. The odds had shifted. The man reached into his jacket pocket, and Ethan went rigid. But what came out was a phone. The man looked at the phone, then he looked at the three bikes. His expression didn't change. He was reading something on the screen or sending something. Then he put the phone away, walked to the van's driver door, got in, and pulled out of the lot without hurry. Back tires spraying gravel, tail lights disappearing into the rain heading south. The engines idled. One of the riders swung off his bike and walked toward the far fence where the girl in the yellow slicker was still crouched in the dark. He moved at a measured pace, hands out and visible, saying something Ethan couldn't hear over the rain. 30 seconds later, he came back carrying her. Her arms locked around his neck, her face buried against his shoulder, not making a sound anymore. The second rider had stayed on his bike, watching the direction the van had gone. Eyes on the road south, not relaxed, waiting. The third one walked toward Ethan. He was a big man, not in the way the man in the dark jacket had been big. That had been the broad-shouldered muscle of someone trained for a specific kind of work. This was something different, the kind of large that gets built over decades. Labor and outdoor work and carrying things, including things that couldn't be seen. He wore a leather cut over a canvas jacket, the cut dark with rain, and on the back Ethan could make out in the yellow light the shape of a cross with angular lines radiating outward and words he couldn't quite read in the poor light. His face had a scar that ran from the edge of his jaw up toward his left cheekbone. Old, faded, the kind that had stopped being a story a long time ago and become just a fact about a face. His eyes were dark and patient. He stopped about 3 feet from Ethan and looked at him for a moment. The look of someone who has encountered something surprising and is taking the time to understand it before saying anything. "You crossed 2 lanes of highway in this rain," the man said, "to do that." It wasn't quite a question. It wasn't quite a statement. It occupied a middle register that Ethan didn't have a category for. 2 lanes, Ethan said, not 4. Something shifted in the man's expression, a degree of compression around the eyes that might on a different face have been the beginning of a smile. 2 lanes, the man said, my mistake. He looked at the gravel where Ethan had fallen, at the abrasion on the heel of Ethan's hand that was bleeding slowly in the rain. Then his eyes moved to Ethan's jacket, to the rectangular shape of something folded against his chest, visible through the wet fabric. "You hurt?" "No." "That's not what I asked." Ethan looked at him. "Ribs. I'll live." The man nodded once, slow. "The 9:15 bus to Amarillo runs this route." Something dropped in Ethan's chest. He turned and looked at the highway. Empty. Dark. The rain made the distance uncertain. "It came through while you were busy," the man said. He said it without inflection, without apology, and without softness, which was somehow worse than if he'd been gentle about it. Just the facts set down between them. Ethan stood in the rain for a moment looking at the highway. 11 foster homes, 12 years. 1 telescope in a backyard facing east. He didn't make a sound. He was very good at not making sounds. He kept the numbers running because as long as they were running, there was still something to think about. Maybe a later bus. Maybe he could call Marlene, explain. Maybe the Callaways would understand. He knew even as the numbers ran that they were noise. The adoption timeline was precise. The hearing window was specific. Marlene had explained it carefully. This was the window, and the window had closed. "What's your name, son?" The word landed in Ethan's chest in a way he hadn't been prepared for. He'd heard it before from caseworkers and foster fathers and strangers, and it had never meant anything. Just a placeholder, a generic label adults use when they didn't know you well enough for anything more specific. But the way this man said it, looking at him through the rain with those patient dark eyes, it didn't sound like a placeholder. "Ethan," he said. "Ethan Rowe." "Hank Briggs," the man said. He didn't offer a hand, which Ethan registered. Not rudeness, something else. "The girl is my daughter, Rosie." He paused. "You crossed 2 lanes of highway in the dark for her." "I heard her." Hank looked at the highway again, at the dark where the bus had been, then back at Ethan. "There's a diner 6 miles north. Warm, coffee, Pie if you want it. He looked at Ethan steadily. You don't have to come, but you're bleeding and your bus is gone and it's going to be 30 degrees before midnight. Ethan looked at the man, at the leather cut with the angular cross on the back, at the other two riders. One still watching the road south with watchful stillness. One holding a 6-year-old girl in a yellow slicker who had fallen asleep against his shoulder in the last 2 minutes. Every version of the numbers was telling him something different now. None of them were coming out clean. I don't need charity, Ethan said. Hank looked at him for a long moment. Good, he said. Neither do I. He turned and walked back toward his bike. 6 miles north, Wheeler's Diner. You're welcome to walk if you prefer. He said it without looking back. Ethan stood in the rain and watched the man mount his Harley, watched the 3 machines idle in a loose cluster. He understood with some part of him that didn't require conscious thought that they were waiting. For him. He walked to Hank Briggs' bike. Wheeler's Diner sat at the junction of Route 87 and Farm Road 241, like something that had decided to stop apologizing for existing. It was not charming. It was a low concrete building with a corrugated metal roof and windows that had been repaired with different grades of glass at different points in the last 40 years. So the light came through them, slightly uneven, slightly warm, in a way that from the outside in the rain and the cold felt almost obscenely welcoming. Inside the diner was warm with the deep warmth of a place that has been heating people for decades. Trapped and saturated into the walls, the vinyl booths, the cracked laminate of the counter. A ceiling fan moved at low speed. A television in the corner above the coffee station showed weather coverage, red and orange bands moving south across the panhandle. The cook, a wide man in a stained apron, looked up from the grill and nodded once at Hank. The nod of recognition between people who have shared a location long enough to develop a shorthand. 2 other customers, an older man at the counter with a newspaper, a woman at a back booth with coffee and her phone. Hank took the corner booth, the one with sightlines to both the door and the parking lot, with the unconscious precision of a man who always sat in corner booths. The other 2 riders took adjacent seats. Rosie had woken up during the ride, perched in front of the rider named Slade, with her arms locked around him in a practiced way that suggested this was not her first time on a motorcycle. She was now sitting between Hank and the wall her yellow slicker shed and draped over the booth. A hot chocolate materialized in front of her with the speed of long-established custom. Ethan sat across from Hank. He was aware of himself in a way he usually managed to suppress. His soaked clothes, the dried blood on his hand, the low continuous complaint from his ribs, and the rectangular presence against his chest where the papers still were. He'd pressed his hand to the outside of his jacket twice on the ride over just to confirm the shape was still there, which it was, which meant nothing now. But he couldn't stop confirming it. Coffee arrived without being ordered. Ethan wrapped both hands around the mug and felt the warmth move up his arms. Rosie was looking at him, the direct, unself-conscious attention of a child who hadn't yet learned that staring was impolite, or who knew and had decided it didn't apply here. You fell down, she said. I did, Ethan said. Did it hurt? A little. She considered this with the gravity of a judge weighing evidence. You should put ice on it, she said. My dad always puts ice on things. That's good advice, Ethan said. Hank was watching him. Not overtly, not the way people stared when they thought they were being subtle. A steady peripheral attention that Ethan had learned to detect over years of being assessed by adults deciding what to do with him. Usually that kind of attention made him perform the version of himself that caused the fewest complications. He didn't quite do that now. He was too tired. His ribs hurt. The coffee was warm. Tell me what you saw, Hank said. Ethan told him. He did it precisely and without embellishment, the way he learned to tell things to caseworkers and school counselors. He described the van, the man, what he'd heard, what he'd seen, the direction the van had gone when it left. And the phone button, the man looking at his phone before he drove away. Not checking it, sending something. Hank listened without interrupting. The other 2 riders listened as well. The one who'd carried Rosie was named Slade. Ethan had caught that from the way the others spoke to him. Lean mid-30s, a tattoo of a compass rose on the inside of his right forearm, a face that was easier to read than the others, which probably cost him in certain situations and was useful in others. The third rider, Darnell, was bigger, early 40s, the kind of face that had been weathered into a permanent state of assessment. He had the hands of someone who worked with engines for a living. Scarred knuckles, grease that didn't quite wash out from under the nails. When Ethan finished, there was a short silence. White cargo van, Darnell said. No visible plates. Rain was too heavy. I couldn't see from that distance. Dark jacket, no insignia. Maybe 6 feet, maybe a little over. Heavy build. He moved like he'd done things like that before. Something passed between Darnell and Hank. Weight being confirmed rather than introduced. Two people receiving information that connects to something they already knew was there. He said it wasn't my problem, Ethan said. Hank looked at him. What did you say? Nothing, I got back up. The corner of Hank's mouth moved, just a fraction. Yeah, he said quietly. I noticed that. Rosie had finished her hot chocolate and was drawing something on a paper napkin with a marker she'd produced from somewhere. Drawing with total absorption, the tip of her tongue just visible at the corner of her mouth. Ethan watched her for a moment, the yellow slicker draped over the booth, the dark hair still damp from the rain. The complete focused calm of a child working on something that mattered. She's alive, he thought. She's alive because I heard her. The thought arrived clean and without noise. No particular emotion attached to it yet. That was how he usually processed things that were too large for immediate feeling. He filed it. He'd come back to it later in whatever space he ended up sleeping tonight. You have somewhere to go, Hank asked. Ethan looked at him. The reflex answer was right there. The answer that didn't require explaining. The answer that kept things contained. I'm fine. He used it like a tool, sharpened over years. But Hank Briggs was looking at him with the patient eyes of a man who had heard that particular answer before many times from many people and understood exactly what it cost the person saying it. There was nothing pitying in the look. Nothing soft, just recognition. The flat, clean recognition of someone who understood the particular mathematics of I'm fine. Not tonight, Ethan said. Hank nodded, one slow nod, like a door opening just enough to let light through. There's a couch at the ranch, he said, clean, warm, no obligations attached to it. He picked up his coffee. You can figure out what comes next in the morning, when it's not 30 degrees and you can think without your ribs getting in the way. Ethan looked at the papers in his jacket. He didn't touch them, just felt their presence. I'll need to call my caseworker, he said. There's a phone, Hank said. Outside, the rain was still coming down. The television above the coffee station was showing the weather map in red and orange bands moving south from the panhandle. The cook had started on something that smelled like bacon and warm bread, and the smell was filling the diner in a way that had no business making Ethan's eyes feel the way they were currently feeling. He pressed his fingers once against the papers in his jacket. Then he picked up the coffee. The Iron Cross MC Ranch was 14 miles north of Wheelers, down a county road that the rain had turned to something between mud and memory. Ethan rode behind Hank with both hands gripping the seat rails the way Hank had told him to before they left the lot. Not my jacket, not my shoulders, the rails. He watched the headlights of Slade's and Darnell's bikes behind them through the rain. The ranch appeared out of the dark as a collection of shapes, a main house long and low, a workshop building with its doors closed against the weather, what looked like a bunkhouse set back from the others. Fencing repaired in different materials, across different decades functional rather than decorative. Several motorcycles under a covered lean-to, their chrome catching the amber light above the main house door. A dog met them in the yard, large and dark-coated with no aggression and considerable enthusiasm. Rosie addressed it immediately, Ranger, and crouched to receive the greeting with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Inside the main house, Ethan was given dry clothes from a box of mixed sizes that seemed maintained for this kind of eventuality without anyone needing to explain why. He was shown the bathroom, the kitchen, the couch. Wide, clean, covered in a quilt that had been washed enough times to feel like something organic rather than fabric. He was given a glass of water. Then he was left alone. He sat on the couch for a while in the quiet and listened to the sounds of the ranch. Rain on the metal roof, Ranger settling somewhere nearby. Voices from another room low and indistinct. The creak of an old building making peace with the weather. He unfolded the papers from his jacket and looked at them. His name in the official font. The Callaway's names, the court seal, the date. He folded them back, but this time when he put them away, he put them in the outside pocket, not the inner one, not against his chest. He didn't fully understand why the distinction mattered, but it did. He lay down on the couch and listened to the ranch. He didn't sleep for a long time, but the rain on the roof was steady and the house was warm, and Ranger had come to rest somewhere near his feet, and at some point, between one breath and the next, the calculations stopped running, and the quiet took over, and he was gone. The morning came in gray and cold. Rain finished. Sky still the color of undecided weather, low and flat and featureless over the scrubland. Ethan woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of boots on the wooden kitchen floor. And for 4 seconds in that gap between sleep and full consciousness, where the mind hasn't yet reconstructed its inventory of current problems, he felt something he rarely felt. Not happiness exactly, not its formal version, something in the same family. Warmth, stillness, the absence of immediate threat. Then the inventory reconstructed, and he sat up. Hank was in the kitchen. He handed Ethan a mug without commentary, the way you hand someone a mug when they're a known quantity, in a familiar space which Ethan was not, and which had no history between them, but which felt, and this was the part that unsettled him, not forced. Hank moved through his kitchen like a man who had made peace with his objects long ago. The coffee maker, the cabinet where the mugs lived, the window above the sink with the view of the covered lean-to and the bikes. He moved through it all with the unconscious competence of deep familiarity. This was what a space you'd built for yourself looked like. This was what belonging to a place looked like from the outside. Ethan wrapped his hands around the mug and sat at the kitchen table. "I called Marlene Shaw last night," Hank said. He was at the stove, not looking at Ethan. "After you were asleep, use the number on your phone. Rosie saw it on the screen when you were checking the bus." Ethan looked at him. "She needed to know you were safe," Hank said. "I told her what happened. The van, the man." Ethan processed this. "What did she say?" Hank was quiet for a moment. "She said she'd make some calls." The way he said it, flat and measured, carried a subtext that Ethan read carefully. "She said that," Ethan said. "And you don't think she will?" "I think she'll try," Hank said. He turned from the stove. "I think the system she works inside has limitations on what trying can accomplish. That's not her fault, it's the system." Ethan looked at the table. Someone had repaired a crack in the middle with wood epoxy, filled it precisely, sanded it smooth, left it visible rather than hiding it. The table was functional. The repair was honest. "The Callaways," Ethan said. "The window closed," Hank said. "Not cruelly, just the fact." "I know," Ethan said. He said it quietly, and Hank didn't respond to it, which was the correct thing to do. Some facts didn't need a response. They needed to be set down and acknowledged, and then given space to be what they were. Rosie appeared from the hallway in pajamas and socks with small wolves printed on them. Her dark hair in a condition that suggested the night had been eventful. She came directly to the table, pulled out the chair across from Ethan, sat in it, and looked at him with the same uncompromising directness from the diner. "Are you staying?" she asked. "Rosie," Hank said from the stove. "I'm just asking." Ethan looked at her, 6 years old, yellow slicker the night before, dragged toward a van in the rain. Looking at him now with clear eyes and an expression that had no visible residue of the night before in it, or if it did, had filed it somewhere specific and decided the present moment required different data. "I don't know yet," he said. She considered this, nodded once with the solemnity of someone accepting a reasonable answer. "Then Ranger likes you," she said. "He slept by your couch." Ethan hadn't known that. He looked down as if the dog might still be there, but Ranger had gone outside. He looked back at Rosie. "That's good to know," he said. "Dogs are better judges than people," she said with the confidence of someone quoting received wisdom, and reached across the table to take a piece of his toast. Through the kitchen window, Ethan could see the workshop building. Doors open now, someone already inside. The sound of a wrench on something mechanical reaching the house at intervals. He'd seen 5 bikes in total under the lean-to, 3 riders last night. More people who were part of whatever this place was. He didn't know what to call it yet. He had the word ranch and the angular cross on the leather cuts and the name Iron Cross MC, and the sense gathered from small signals, the way he'd learned to gather things carefully from a distance before committing to interpretation, that this was not a casual arrangement. These were not men who happened to share a zip code. There was something structural here, something deliberate, the kind of family that gets built rather than inherited. He knew what that looked like from the outside. He'd been on the outside of it his whole life. Marlene Shaw called at 9:17. He took it on the porch, the cold air sharp and clean after the rain. The sky still gray but no longer threatening. Her voice was careful. The voice she used when she was about to deliver something he wouldn't want to receive and had been rehearsing how to say it. "Ethan, first, are you okay? Mr. Briggs said you were hurt." "I'm fine." Then because he was trying something different, "Ribs, not broken." "Good." Pause. "Good. Ethan, I need you to know what you did last night was incredibly brave and also incredibly dangerous, and I need you to promise me that in the future, the Callaways," he said. A longer pause, the kind that confirmed what he already knew. "I spoke with their attorney this morning," Marlene said. "They completely understand the circumstances." "They do. But the court review has a specific schedule, and there's a waiting period between—" She stopped. "Tried again. The window for this particular review has closed, Ethan." "How long?" "6 to 8 months minimum, possibly longer depending on the docket." He was looking at the workshop building. Someone had come out, a man he hadn't seen before, wearing a canvas jacket carrying a coffee cup, who looked at Ethan on the porch with a neutral nod and went back inside. "6 to 8 months, Ethan said. "I'm so sorry, Ethan." He did not say anything harsh to Marlene Shaw because she was not the problem and she was not unkind, and there was nothing useful to be said. "I'll call you Monday," he said. "Where will you be staying in the meantime?" He looked at the porch, at the wood grain under his shoes, at the ranch yard and the bikes and the workshop and the light coming up slowly over the flat Texas landscape. "Here," he said. "For now." He heard it in his own voice and recognized it as true, even though he wasn't sure when he decided it. He didn't know what was coming. He didn't know what this place was yet fully. He didn't know the story behind Hank Briggs's scar, or why 5 motorcycles were parked here, or what had happened to Rosie's mother, or what the Iron Cross MC was precisely beyond a name and a cross on a leather cut, and 3 men who'd appeared out of a rainstorm like something the weather itself had sent. He knew one thing: the man in the dark jacket had looked at his phone before he drove away. He had looked at it and then driven south, and that look had not felt like retreat. It had felt like reporting, like something being confirmed and passed along to someone who was waiting for exactly that confirmation. Ethan folded his phone into his pocket and went inside to find out what the Iron Cross MC had for breakfast. He had 6 months to fill. He had nowhere else to be. He had adoption papers in an outside pocket instead of against his chest. He had, for the first time in 12 years, something that might be worth protecting. He just didn't know yet that something had already been set in motion, that it had been coming for him specifically since long before that rainstorm, since before the Callaway group home, before Marlene Shaw and her lavender hand cream, before the 6th foster home, or the 3rd, or the 1st. Since before Ethan Rowe was old enough to understand that boys like him could be worth something to the wrong kind of people. And somewhere on a highway heading south in a white cargo van with no visible plates, a phone was dark on the seat beside a man named Driscoll. He had already sent his message. The reply had come back in under a minute. 2 words. Phase 2. The second day at the Iron Cross Ranch began the way the first one had ended, with the smell of coffee and the sound of boots on wood floors, and Ranger conducting a slow, optimistic circuit around the perimeter of the kitchen, looking for anything that might fall. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with both hands around his mug and watched the workshop through the window. The doors were open. Someone was already inside, moving with the economy of a person who knew exactly where every tool lived and had stopped thinking about the act of reaching for them. Rosie ate cereal with the focused efficiency of a child who had somewhere to be in her own head. The spoon moved in a rhythm that suggested she was planning something or replaying something or both. She had the quality of stillness that children sometimes carry after frightening experiences. Not the silence of damage, the silence of processing, the mind running its own quiet work in the background while the surface stayed clear. Hank came in from outside, shrugging off his canvas jacket. Cold air arrived with him and then dissipated. He looked at Ethan the way he'd been looking at him since the diner. that steady peripheral attention that never quite resolved into a direct question. "Workshop at 10, he said, "if you want something to do with your hands." Ethan looked at him. "I don't know engines." Nobody does the first time. It wasn't an invitation exactly. It wasn't an order. It occupied the middle register that Hank Briggs seemed to live in, the place where things were offered without pressure and refused without consequence, which was itself a kind of pressure because Ethan had no framework for spaces that worked that way. "Okay," Ethan said. The workshop was a long building with concrete floors and industrial lighting and the particular smell of motor oil and metal shavings and old coffee. Darnell Webb was at the far end deep inside a stripped-down engine on a workbench. Tools laid out with the precision of someone who treated disorder as a philosophical position worth opposing. He didn't look up when Ethan came in, but something in his posture registered the arrival. Barrett Locke was running diagnostics on a bike elevated on a hydraulic lift. Ethan noticed the prosthetic left hand on the second look, not the first, which was the point. Barrett managed it with a dexterity that made the absence of the original feel like a detail rather than a defining fact. Something you'd eventually learn about him, but that wouldn't change much once you did. A man Ethan hadn't met yet sat on a metal stool near the door with a thermos and a tablet. Gray-bearded, late 50s, maybe older. The kind of face that had been weathered past the point where weather could do anything more to it. He looked at Ethan when Hank brought him in, and his look was different from the others. More careful, more specifically curious. As if Ethan were a piece of data that needed to be properly categorized before anything else could proceed. "Garrett Flynn," Hank said. Garrett set down the thermos. "The boy from the bus stop." "Ethan," Hank said. "I know his name." Garrett looked at him for a moment. "Marlene Shaw called Darnell this morning." The room changed slightly, not in temperature, in air pressure, the way pressure changes when something that has been building finds a surface. Hank looked at Darnell, who had not stopped working on the engine, but whose hands had paused on a specific bolt. 8:40, Darnell said without turning around. "She wanted to know what kind of operation we were running, whether the ranch was a safe placement." He picked up the wrench again. "I told her it was a private residence and she was welcome to file a formal inquiry through the county." Ethan understood the shift, but couldn't fully read its source. He looked at Garrett, who was still watching him with that careful attention. "She called to check on me," Ethan said. "She called to document herself," Garrett said. "Not unkindly, just precisely." "There's a difference." Hank's jaw moved slightly, the muscular compression of a man deciding not to say something. "She's doing her job," he said. The tone suggested observation, not endorsement. "She's doing her job the way people do days when the job has too many cases and not enough hours," Garrett said. He looked at Ethan. "You know how many kids in this county are in active foster placement right now?" "Garrett," Hank said, "I am asking." Ethan looked at him. "I don't know the county number. The state number is around 22,000. Garrett looked at him for a moment. Something in his expression recalibrated. "How do you know that?" "I looked it up," Ethan said. "When I was 9, I wanted to know how many of us there were." The workshop was quiet except for the sound of Darnell's wrench and the low hum of Barrett's diagnostic equipment. Garrett nodded once. Not softly, not with pity. The nod of someone acknowledging a piece of information that shifts their understanding of a situation. "Give him the brake job on the dynamo," Garrett said to Hank. "He says he doesn't know engines." "Then he'll learn something today." Garrett picked up his tablet again. "Start with what's broken. It's easier." Ethan spent the morning in the vocabulary of brake calipers and rotor thickness and hydraulic lines. Barrett explained and Ethan listened and asked questions that were precise enough that by the third hour, Barrett had stopped explaining in simplified terms and started talking to him the way he talked to the others. Direct, technical, abbreviated, no patience wasted on things that didn't need to be said. Ethan did not pretend to understand things he didn't understand. He asked the same question twice when the first answer wasn't sufficient. Barrett seemed to respect this, or at least didn't find it aggravating. Hank came by once, checked the work without commentary, moved on. By noon, both of Ethan's hands were dark with grease, and he had a functional understanding of the front brake assembly and a low, continuous ache in his ribs that he was managing by breathing deliberately and not twisting his torso in specific directions. Garrett watched from his stool and said nothing. It was the nothing that Ethan kept returning to. The quality of the silence in the workshop. Not the silence of people ignoring each other. Not the hostile quiet of spaces where his presence was unwanted. The silence of people who had learned to share space without requiring it to be filled. Most places filled silence as a defensive act noise to paper over discomfort. These men let it exist. They worked inside it without flinching. He didn't know what to do with that yet, so he kept working. Lunch was at a folding table inside the workshop. Sandwiches and coffee in a bag of chips that Barrett had materialized from somewhere, the logistics of which were never discussed. Rosie appeared from the direction of the main house with Ranger, at her heels climbed onto a stool and inserted herself into the proceedings with the confidence of someone who had always been included and expected no different. She sat across from Ethan and ate without looking at him directly, which was unusual for her and which meant she was thinking about something she hadn't decided whether to say yet. Ethan had learned in one day that Rosie Briggs almost always said the things she was thinking about. The delay was the interesting part. It was during lunch that he heard the name for the first time. Darnell said it quietly to Garrett, not under his breath exactly, but below the register of normal conversation. Ethan caught it because he'd learned to monitor those frequencies. Group home life required a precise attention to what was being said just outside direct address. Slate moved the timeline, Darnell said. 2 weeks, maybe less. Garrett's expression didn't change. How far confirmed? Slade verified it this morning. A pause. Garrett looked at Hank, who was standing at the work table with his back to the room. Hank's posture shifted. Something gathered in the set of his shoulders. A body making a decision before the person attached to it quite knew what it was. Then we're already behind, Garrett said. None of them looked at Ethan. None of them acknowledged that he might have heard. The conversation moved back into normal register and the moment folded away. But Ethan filed it carefully. Slate, timeline, already behind. He ate his sandwich and watched Ranger conduct a slow strategic circuit around the perimeter of the table and didn't ask. Not yet. Rosie waited until the others had gone back to their work. Then she looked at Ethan with the directness she'd been holding in reserve and said, "Can I show you something?" She had a collection of small engine parts that Barrett had evidently set aside for her. Nothing with edges, nothing that could cause harm. Clean components, washers and bolts, and a small housing from something long decommissioned. She'd arranged them on the floor of the workshop in patterns that had their own internal logic. Not random, not quite mechanical. Something between the two following rules that only she could see. Ethan sat down on the concrete floor across from her. "What are you building?" he asked. She looked up at him. "I don't know yet. I start and then it tells me." He looked at the arrangement. There was something coherent in it, not immediately legible, but not arbitrary either. "Does that work?" he said. "Starting before you know." She looked at him with the patient directness of someone explaining something self-evident. "That's how everything works," she said. He thought about the adoption papers in his outside pocket, about the decision he'd made crossing 2 lanes of highway in the rain without thinking first, about sitting on this floor right now. "Yeah," he said, "maybe." She handed him a bolt. He turned it in his fingers. She went back to her arrangement with complete absorption, the tip of her tongue just visible at the corner of her mouth. Then she said without looking up, "The man last night smelled like cigarettes and something else." Ethan kept his hands still. "Chemical," she said. She adjusted a washer, considering. "I've smelled it before." He looked at her carefully. "Before last night. At the school thing, the beginning of the year. Orientation." She paused, moving a small housing a centimeter to the left. There was a man there who smelled like that. He was talking to the placement lady. Something moved through Ethan's chest, cold and very specific. "What placement lady?" he said. He kept his voice at exactly the pitch it had been before. Unhurried, curious but not urgent. "The one who does the paperwork, for the kids who don't have houses." Rosie looked up at him. Her expression was clear and uncomplicated. She was reporting a fact, nothing more. "She had a table at orientation. I saw him standing by her table talking to her. He was there for a while." Ethan made himself breathe at a normal rate, made himself keep his face where it was. "Rosie," he said carefully, "did you tell your dad?" "I forgot," she said. "I forgot about the smell until last night." A small crease appeared between her brows, the first indication of something like unease. Is it bad? I don't know, he said honestly. It might be important. You should tell your dad today. Can you do that? She looked at him for a moment, reading him the way she'd been reading him since the diner. Then the crease smoothed. She nodded, picked up the bolt from his fingers, added it to her arrangement. Ethan stood up and went to find Hank. What happened next moved fast, and then stopped, and then moved fast again. The rhythm of people who had managed crises before. Not calm, contained, panic channeled into specific action, noise compressed into useful motion. Hank listened to what Ethan relayed, then called Rosie in and listened again, his face doing nothing visible, while his daughter described in her straightforward way the man at the orientation table, the smell, the placement lady with her paperwork. Then Hank found Garrett. Garrett made 2 phone calls, short and precise. He came back with his face arranged in an expression Ethan hadn't seen on it before. Not anger, something older and more controlled. The expression of someone receiving confirmation of something suspected for a very long time. The orientation, Garrett said, it was run jointly, County School District and the Foster Care Coordination Office. He looked at Hank. You're placement coordinator for this district. Patrice Holden, Hank said. He said it the way you say the name of something you've suspected for a long time without having proof. Patrice Holden, Garrett confirmed. Who is she? Ethan asked. Garrett looked at him. She's the woman who signed your last 3 placement approvals. He said it without softness and without pity, the tone of delivering information that cannot be made smaller than it is. She's also been the coordinating caseworker for every child in the foster system in this county for 9 years. The number settled in the air. 9 years. She's been there 9 years, Ethan said. In that time, Garrett said, 14 children under her coordination have gone missing. 3 were found, 2 within the county, 1 in Oklahoma. He paused. The other 11 are still listed as runaways. Ethan had been in 11 foster homes. He had the vertiginous sensation of standing at the edge of something enormous without being able to see its full shape. Only the edge. Only the drop. Last night wasn't random, he said. We don't know that yet, Hank said, but you think it. Hank looked at him without speaking for long enough that the silence was its own answer. Ethan looked at the map on the wall of the main room. He'd noticed it on his first walk through the house. Hand annotated, different colored marks across the county. He crossed to it, and Garrett watched but didn't stop him. He looked at the marks. He'd grown up navigating systems, school systems, placement systems, the invisible bureaucratic architecture that moved children from column to column on spreadsheets without their input or knowledge. He knew how to read a system from its artifacts, and this map was a systems artifact. Green marks in a rough perimeter around the county's central area, too consistent, too evenly distributed to be random. He looked at the density, the deliberate spacing, patrol routes, he thought, response positions. The Iron Cross had been building a watch over years, red marks, fewer, clustered, appearing inside the green perimeter. He looked at their positions and tried to think about what they might represent. 3 red marks inside the perimeter. The most recent one pressed harder into the paper than the others, leaving a slight indentation visible even across the room. He looked at it for a long moment, then at Hank. What are the red marks? Hank looked at Garrett. Something passed between them. Confirmed locations, Garrett said carefully, related to the van. Ethan looked at the most recent red mark, then at the county road notation beside it. Route 87. He stood at the map and the pieces arranged themselves the way Rosie's parts arranged themselves on the workshop floor. Not because he forced them, because they told him. The Iron Cross has been building a perimeter, he said. He said it to the room, not to anyone specific. You've been watching, running protection routes, logging incidents. He looked at the red marks inside the green, and someone has been working inside that perimeter. 3 times in the last, he checked the dates beside the marks, 8 months. He turned around. I was transferred to this county 8 months ago, he said. From Abilene, by Patrice Holden. He looked at Hank. Holden knows the perimeter exists. She'd have to if her coordination office cross-references with county welfare. She'd know exactly where the Iron Cross watches. He paused. She moved me inside your watch, not to protect me. He said it quietly and without drama because that was the only way to say it. To make me accessible. And when I disappeared inside your territory, the investigation would circle back here, to Iron Cross. The room was quiet. Darnell, who had been standing at the side door with his arms crossed, said, "You got all that from a map." "I got all that from 12 years of watching adults make decisions about children on spreadsheets," Ethan said. Something moved through the room, not loud, not demonstrative. The temperature of people arriving at a truth they had been approaching from different directions and finding it the same when they got there. Garrett looked at Hank. "He's right. He could be," Hank said. "The pattern fits," Barrett said from the doorway of the workshop. He'd been listening from the threshold. The 3 incidents inside the perimeter, the timing of his transfer. Holden's office has full visibility on our filed reports. She'd know our routes within a margin of error. Darnell was looking at the floor, the posture of a man working through something he doesn't want to be working through. "That's inference," he said, "not evidence." "It's enough to ask questions," Hank said. "It's enough to be careful," Garrett said. Ethan pressed his fingers to the papers in his outside pocket. He'd been placed in this county 8 months ago, transferred from Abilene by a caseworker he'd never met, assigned to the Callaway group home by a coordination office he'd never visited, in a system managed by a woman whose name he'd never heard until 30 minutes ago. Transferred here. He thought about that word. Transferred. The passive construction of it. The way it implied movement without agency. You didn't transfer yourself. You were transferred by someone with the authority to move children from one column to another. He thought about the man on the highway who had looked at his phone and driven south. Not running. Reporting. What if it was never just Rosie they were positioning for? The thought arrived fully formed. He didn't push it away. He had learned that thoughts which arrive fully formed in the middle of crises were usually carrying information worth examining. He filed it, and he held the rest. That evening, the tension arrived in a form he hadn't expected. It came from Darnell. They were in the main room after dinner. All the core writers gathered, and Garrett was on the phone with someone whose voice Ethan couldn't make out from where he sat at the edge of the room. The others waited for the call to finish. When Garrett hung up, Darnell spoke before he could report. "The kid can't be here." The room went still. Darnell wasn't looking at Ethan, he was looking at Hank. His voice had no venom in it, no personal hostility. It was the voice of a man saying something he believed needed to be said and had been calculating how to phrase all afternoon. "Darnell," Hank started. "Let me finish." He looked at his hands, then at Hank. "If what Garrett's contact is pointing at is right, and if Holden is connected to what happened on the highway, then having this boy here puts Rosie at the center of something we don't fully understand yet. He came into our space connected to people who are watching our space. That's not the kid's fault, but it's a fact." "He came because of Rosie," Hank said. His voice was level and contained. "I know why he came. He crossed a highway in the dark because she was screaming." "I know what he did, Hank." The room absorbed this. Darnell looked at the floor. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted to something lower and more deliberate. "You're doing that thing. The thing where you see someone who needs something and it becomes the club's concern before there's been a vote." The room was very still. "Is that what you think I'm doing?" Hank said. "I think you see this kid and you see—" Darnell stopped. Looked at the wall. Exhaled. "This isn't about the kid. This is about Rosie. She was almost taken last night. You want to be angry and you haven't found the right place to put it yet." "Don't tell me what I'm channeling," Hank said. Quiet. The quietness of controlled force. Not loud. The opposite of loud. Darnell looked at him, didn't flinch, didn't recalibrate. "We took a vote when you brought Barrett in," he said. "When you brought Slade. We took a vote because that's the agreement. If you want him here, Hank, you want to make that call, then make it the way we agreed. Or tell me the rules we built only apply when they're convenient." The room held the silence. Ethan looked at Hank's face and saw something he hadn't seen on it before. Not defeat, not anger exactly. The expression of a man who is right about something and has to contend with the fact that the person arguing against him is also right about something, and the two rightnesses don't resolve cleanly into one another. "He's not going back to a group home," Hank said. His voice had returned to level but carried a different texture now. The texture of a decision that had been reached and was not going to be unmade. "Not with Holden in the picture. Not until we know how wide this runs." Then we take the vote, Darnell said. Then we take the vote. Darnell nodded once, picked up his coffee, set it back down. Full table, he said. Tomorrow morning. Full table, Hank agreed. Ethan sat in his chair at the edge of the room and felt the weight of the conversation redistribute across the space. He did not feel insulted by it. He understood it with the precise understanding of someone who had spent 14 years being moved through systems designed by other people for purposes that were never his own. What had just happened was not about him and also entirely about him, and the difference mattered. He also understood that Darnell was not wrong. He was a stranger in a complicated space. He was possibly a liability, and liabilities had a way of pulling whatever was aimed at them through whatever spaces they occupied. He looked at Hank. "You don't have to fight about this," he said. "I can leave." Hank looked at him. "You can't go back to Callaway." "I didn't say Callaway." Where then? Not asking, requesting the alternative, asking him to produce the option that existed which both of them knew did not exist, and the knowing sat between them in the room like a third presence. "Tomorrow," Hank said. "Full table. You'll be there." "Why, because it's your life. You should be in the room when it's decided." Ethan had never been in a room where a decision about his life was being made and been invited to stay for it. In every version he'd experienced, the decision happened elsewhere. In offices, in phone calls, in the institutional machinery that moved children from column to column. And you found out afterward. You were the subject, not a party to it. "Okay," he said. Outside, the night was cold and still. The county road in both directions lay empty under the hard November sky. But somewhere south of the ranch, moving without urgency along the shoulder of the road, a gray sedan with no visible front plates rolled at 11 miles per hour past the ranch's front gate. Its headlights were off. It didn't slow, didn't stop. It continued past the gate opening, moved another 100 yards, pulled onto the shoulder of the county road, and sat with its engine idling. The driver was looking at the ranch through a long lens, looking and counting and measuring. Inside the main house, everyone was either asleep or nearly so. No one was watching the road. The sedan sat there for 18 minutes. Then it pulled back onto the road and continued north and disappeared into the dark. It was Slade who found the evidence the next morning. Not the vehicle itself, which was long gone, but the oil drip on the road shoulder where it had parked. The pattern of a vehicle that had sat idling on gravel for an extended period. He crouched at the edge of the road in the early light and looked at it, and his face did something specific and quiet, and then he went back inside. "Company," he said. That was all he needed to say. The full table vote happened at 8 o'clock in the main room of the ranch house. 7 men. Ethan at one end, not quite at the table in the chair that Slade had placed there without comment. Present but not presuming membership. Hank laid it out clean and unembellished. What Rosie had seen at orientation. What Garrett's contacts had confirmed about Patrice Holden. The pattern of disappeared children across 9 years. The van. Driscoll's phone activity before leaving the scene. And then the question he hadn't articulated the night before. He looked at Ethan. "There's a possibility, Hank said, that the abduction attempt on Tuesday night had a dual target. That Rosie was an opportunity. That the primary," he paused, looked at the table, then back at Ethan. "That someone knew you were going to be at that bus stop." The room waited. "Patrice Holden processed my transfer to this county," Ethan said. "Yes. She had my placement history, my schedule. She'd have known I was taking the 9:15. "Yes." "How long has the van been operational in this area?" "Best estimate 8 months, Garrett said, matching your transfer window." Ethan looked at the map on the wall, at the colored marks. He didn't ask what they all meant. He'd already worked most of it out. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Darnell repeated it across the table. Not mockery, the tone of a man hearing something that confirms a position he didn't want to hold. He looked at Ethan for a long moment. "I owe you an apology, what I said last night, what I implied." Ethan looked at him. "You came in from outside, and I treated that as a threat before I treated it as a fact," Darnell said. "You're 14 years old and someone put you in that bus stop on purpose. That doesn't make you wrong to be here. It makes you exactly where you should be." A beat. Then he looked at Hank. "I vote yes." They voted. 7 ayes, No dissent. Barrett last. He held something back for a moment before speaking, and in that moment, Ethan saw the complexity again. Something in Barrett's expression that had more layers than the current situation seemed to contain. Something being carried that hadn't been set down yet. Yes, Barrett said, but there's something else. He opened a folder on the table. I did some work this morning. Transfer records from Holden's coordination office, not just Ethan's, all of them across 9 years. He turned a page. The pattern isn't random, age-specific, 7 to 15, children with minimal family connection. No legal advocate, children who would plausibly disappear into the runaway category without generating serious investigation. He set the page down. There's a name in the coordination records, he continued. Appears 3 times, not as a caseworker, not as a county official. The term used is independent placement consultant. He looked at Hank. Warren Slate. Darnell's jaw moved. Garrett made a sound that was not a word. Hank went completely still. Ethan looked around the table at these 7 men and watched something move through them collectively. The temperature of people receiving confirmation of something they feared but could not prove. The kind of weight that lives below rage because rage has motion in it, and this had none yet. It was still contained, still just knowledge sitting in the room like an unexploded thing. Who is Warren Slate? Ethan asked. Hank looked at him. For the first time since the bus stop, the patience in his eyes had something running beneath it that was not controlled. Something that had been building in a particular direction for a long time and had just received the piece it needed to become a destination. Warren Slate, Hank said, is the reason Rosie's mother is dead. The sentence landed in the room and did not dissipate. It sat there, and the room sat around it. Ethan looked at Hank's face, at the scar on his jaw, at the stillness of his hands on the table. He looked at the map with its colored marks. He thought about 14 children, 11 listed as runaways who were not runaways, a transfer pattern across 9 years, a name appearing 3 times in records that nobody was supposed to be reading. He thought about a telescope in a backyard facing east, in a bedroom with morning light, and a woman who had remembered that he mentioned astronomy in passing. That window is closed, he thought. The only window in front of you is the one you haven't seen yet. He was good at math. He'd always been good at math. He ran the numbers. They came back with a single answer that was not safe and not comfortable, and had no version of itself that ended without a confrontation with something enormous and organized. Something that had been moving children through a system for 9 years and had put him in this county and sent a man named Driscoll to a bus stop in the rain. But the numbers also said something else, something he hadn't had before. You are not alone in this room. That was a variable he had never had before. What do we do? Ethan asked. Hank looked at him, then at the table, then back at the map. We start by finding out how much Slate knows about what we know, he said. He looked at Garrett. I need your federal contact. Not county, not state. Federal. Garrett's phone was already in his hand. Garrett's federal contact had a name that would come later. What he said first when Garrett reached him was that he needed Garrett to call back on a different number, which Garrett did, which meant the call took 14 minutes to complete instead of 2 because some conversations required a different kind of line. While Garrett was on the phone, the gray sedan came back. It didn't come to the gate this time. It parked on the road shoulder north of the ranch entrance at the point where the fence line curved and broke the sight line from the main house window. Slade saw it because Slade had been watching the road since he'd found the oil drip that morning. He had positioned himself at the corner of the workshop where he could see the road without being seen from it. He came inside without hurrying. Same vehicle, he said. Different position, better angle. Nobody said anything for a moment. They're measuring, Ethan said. Hank looked at him. They're not watching to see if we react. They already know we're here. They're measuring response time, how fast we notice, where we position, what we do when we see them. He looked at Slade. Did you let them see you when you came in? No, Slade said. Good. Then they don't know what we know. Ethan looked at Hank. How long before Garrett's contact calls back? He said 20 minutes. Then we wait. Garrett's contact called back in 17 minutes. Garrett took the call in the kitchen, standing at the window with his back to the room, and the others waited in the particular way of people who have learned that some information needs to arrive fully before anyone responds to any part of it. When Garrett turned around, his expression had done something Ethan hadn't seen it do in 3 days. A degree of recalibration around the eyes and jaw, the expression of someone receiving information that changes the shape of a situation they thought they had already understood. My contact says the task force has been aware of Warren Slate for 2 years, Garrett said. Active federal investigation, trafficking money, laundering corruption of public officials across 4 states. The room absorbed this. 2 years, Hank said, not a question. 2 years, Garrett confirmed. Darnell looked at the floor. And nobody contacted us. They were aware of Iron Cross's involvement in the county. They categorized the club as, Garrett paused, looked at his phone, looked up, a complicating variable in an active federal operation. Slade said something under his breath that didn't need to be repeated. They didn't want us moving on to Slade before they were ready, Garrett said. They were managing their own timeline, protecting their case. He paused. My contact also mentioned a name, federal prosecutor out of Amarillo, Ren Castillo. She's been building the Slate case for 18 months, and she's the one holding the warrant. Slate moved the timeline, Darnell said. He said it to the room, not to anyone specific. 2 weeks, maybe less. That's what you told me 2 days ago? Which means Slate knows something the federal task force doesn't, Garrett said. The room understood what he wasn't saying. If Slate had moved his own timeline, it meant he knew the investigation was closing. He was accelerating before they could lock the door. Ethan had been listening from his position at the edge of the table. He looked at the map on the wall, at the red marks inside the green perimeter, at the most recent one on Route 87. He knows they're close, Ethan said. That's why he moved. That's why Tuesday night happened when it did. He looked at Hank. He's not just running. He's collecting. Loose ends evidence, anything that connects him to what Holden was doing. The words loose ends had a very precise meaning in this context, and they landed in his own chest with the weight of something that had been true for a while and was only now being named correctly. I'm a loose end, Ethan said. You witnessed an attempted abduction that connects directly to his operation, Hank said. You're a minor in the foster system with no legal advocate. You're mobile. You can be moved, transferred, relocated without triggering an investigation. He said it without inflection and without softening, because the only useful thing in this moment was precision. Yes, to Slate you're a loose end. And Rosie, Ethan said. Hank's jaw tightened once, then released. Rosie saw Driscoll's face clearly. She could identify him. She can place him at orientation talking to Holden. He looked at the others. Slate doesn't know what she's told us. He doesn't know if we've connected him to Holden, but he knows she saw a face. The gray sedan was still parked on the road shoulder, still measuring, still sending back whatever it was seeing. Ethan had been looking at the map while the others spoke. He turned around. Has anyone searched her room, he said, since Donna died? The room went quiet in a way that was different from the other silences. Hank looked at him. Her space, Hank said. Nobody goes through Rosie's space without me. I'm not saying go through it, Ethan said. He kept his voice level and direct because the only way to say what needed to be said was without performance. I'm saying if Donna left documentation somewhere, if she was building evidence from inside Slate's network, and she needed to put it somewhere safe, somewhere Slate's people wouldn't look, somewhere that would survive if she didn't. He stopped. Rosie is 6 years old. She's been living in that room for 18 months. If something is in there, she might not know what it is. She might not know she's been keeping it. The room was very still. The gray sedan wasn't a warning, Ethan said. It was a survey. He's not coming here for a loose end. He's coming for evidence. Evidence that his own people documented and that Dana Briggs got her hands on before she died. And he will not care what's between him and it. Hank stood at the table with one hand flat on the wood. His eyes were closed for a count of 3. Then they opened and he was Hank Briggs again. Hardly patient eyes. The particular stillness of a man who has been through enough that being through more things is not a transformation. Just a continuation. I go in alone, he said. Nobody argued. He walked down the hallway. The door opened. The door closed. Nobody spoke. The workshop outside was silent. The farm road beyond the fence was empty. Ranger lay near the back door with his chin on his paws, watching the hallway. Ethan stood at the table and counted, because counting was what he did when the alternative was feeling the full weight of what was in the air. He counted 11 minutes. Through the closed door, he heard Rosie's voice muffled asking something. Then Hank's voice, low and careful, the register of a parent navigating something adult in a child's vocabulary. Taking his time with the words because the words mattered, and rushing them would do a different kind of damage than the one he was trying to prevent. When the door opened, Hank was carrying a small wooden box. Not large, the kind that might hold keepsakes rather than valuables. Unstained light wood with a small brass latch. It had the look of something made by hand rather than purchased, made with care and time and attention to detail. Rosie was at his heels in her pajamas and wolf socks. Her expression held the focused, processing calm she brought to the engine parts on the workshop floor, fitting new information carefully into her existing understanding of the world. She looked at Ethan when she came into the room, then at the box in her father's hands. "My mom made that," she said, informative, not defensive. "She kept things in it. She said it was for safekeeping." She looked at Hank. "She said if anyone ever asked about the box, I should only talk to you. Nobody ever asked, so I just kept it." Hank set the box on the table. Garrett opened it with gloved hands. The gloves had appeared from somewhere on his person without announcement, and Ethan understood that Garrett was a man who carried things like that because he had learned over years of being in exactly these kinds of situations that you needed them before you knew you needed them. Inside a USB drive, a folded document sealed in a clear plastic sleeve, and a handwritten letter on 3 sheets of white paper. The handwriting close and deliberate, the kind that takes time because what is being recorded requires it. Garrett unfolded the document and read. His face moved through several things in sequence. The focused attention of a man reading quickly for summary, then the slower attention of comprehension, then something that arrived and stayed. Not shock. Garrett was not a man given to shock. The expression of someone who has been assembling a picture for a long time and has just received the final piece and found that the picture is larger and darker than all the individual pieces had suggested. 14 names, he said. He did not look up from the document. Public officials, caseworkers, 2 county judges, a state representative, 3 individuals in the foster care coordination network across 2 counties. He turned the page. A list of transactions, dates, amounts, case numbers. He set the page down carefully. Cross-referenced with the disappearance dates. Darnell made a sound that was not a word. "The USB will have more," Barrett said. He was looking at the drive with the expression of a man who understood what data storage could contain. If she was systematic and this looks systematic, the digital record will have originals, photographs, scanned documents, communication records. "She was building a case," Slade said, quietly with something in his voice that was recognition. The recognition of someone who understood what it cost a person to do that kind of thing alone from the inside over a long period of time. She was inside it, and she was building a case against it. "She was scared," Rosie said. Everyone looked at her. She was standing at the edge of the table, not touching anything, looking at the box. Her expression held the same focused calm she brought to everything, placing information carefully into the shape of what she already knew. "She told me the box was for safekeeping," Rosie said. "She told me it was important. She didn't tell me why." She paused. "He came to our house once, before she died. I remember because Ranger didn't like him." She looked at Hank. "He and Mom talked outside. I watched from the window. Ranger stood at the door and growled the whole time." The room held very still. "After the man left," Rosie continued, "I asked Mom who he was. She said he was a man from work and he wouldn't be coming back." She looked at her father. She was crying. "She thought I was asleep, but I saw. She was sitting at the kitchen table, and then she stopped, and she went and got the box from her shelf, and she put something inside, and she locked it." The timestamp on Dana Briggs's death settled over the room. 18 months ago, a single vehicle accident on the interstate, the road dry, the conditions clear. Hank stood at the table with one hand flat on the wood beside the box. His eyes closed for 4 seconds. Then they opened. "Call your contact," he said to Garrett. "Now." "Already dialing." "Barrett, copy the drive. Everything on it. 2 copies, different devices, not connected to the ranch network." "On it." "Slade." Hank looked at him. "I need to know if the sedan is still there and whether it's alone." Slade was already moving toward the door. Ethan picked up the document from the table. He looked at the header, the County Coordination Office seal, his own case number in the upper right corner. Barrett had pulled these records using Ethan's login credentials, his own case file legally accessible to him as the subject of placement. He looked at the list of names. He looked at the transaction records. He looked at the case numbers beside each entry and understood that each number represented a child, a specific child, a child who had been in the same system he had been in, managed by the same woman, processed through the same invisible machinery. He set the document down. "We need to get this to the federal contact directly," he said. "Not through channels that run through the county, not through anything Holden's office has visibility on." "Already on it," Garrett said. He looked up from his phone. "But there's a timing problem. My contact says Castillo's task force is moving within 72 hours. They've been building toward an arrest warrant for 2 years, and they're not going to delay for county coordination records from a filing system." He paused. "They will delay for material new evidence with direct evidentiary value. Evidence that names names they haven't been able to confirm." "The USB," Hank said. "The USB plus Dana's documentation plus the cross-reference to the disappearance dates. If what's on that drive matches what's in that document, my contact says it's the kind of corroboration that changes the shape of an arrest warrant, makes it bigger, includes more names." Garrett looked at the box on the table. "Dana didn't just document Slate. She documented everyone who took his money. That's not one arrest, that's the entire network." Barrett's hands were moving across his device with the focused speed of a man copying data against a clock. The progress bar on the screen, the only thing in the room operating at its own pace without acknowledging the urgency around it. "Done," Barrett said. He pulled the drive, pocketed one copy, handed the second to Garrett. "Transmission is uploading to the federal secure server now. Even if they take the physical drive, the data is already there." The front window exploded inward. Not a gunshot, a stone, large, thrown with force. The kind of opening move designed to announce rather than injure. The kind that says, "We are here and we are not being subtle about it." Glass across the floor. Cold air through the gap. Ranger erupted from somewhere in the back of the house, and the sound he made was not the sound he made when a visitor arrived. Rosie did not make a sound. She pressed closer to Ethan's side, and he felt her grip tighten on his arm, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they moved back down the hallway without being told to. He'd already mapped the hallway on the first day. The door at the end. The window in that room that faced the back of the property away from the road. A voice from outside, male, unhurried. The unhurried quality of a man who believes the outcome is already determined and is allowing the other side to arrive at that conclusion at whatever speed they need. "We just want the box. Nobody needs to be here for the rest of this." Nobody inside moved. Hank looked at Darnell. Darnell shook his head once. Two at the front position, unknown on the sides. Garrett was moving toward the back of the house, not toward cover, toward the exterior wall with the better angle on the farm road. His phone was in his hand and he was not calling anyone. He was opening the camera. Document everything, Ethan thought, even now. Hank looked down the hallway at Ethan. His eyes moved to Rosie, then back to Ethan. The look was compressed and fast, reliant on the understanding that had been building between them across 3 days of shared space and shared crises. It communicated without words. "Keep her back. Keep her down. Don't move until I say." Ethan nodded. Hank opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. He held the shotgun low. His free hand was visible. His face had no performance in it. Not aggressive, not conciliatory. The face of a man who had been through a version of this situation before, and understood that the only thing that mattered now was what you were actually willing to do and whether the other side could read that correctly. Two men in the yard, both large, both in dark jackets without insignia. The one who'd spoken was at the gate, early 40s, wide-shouldered, a face with the smooth, professional blankness of someone trained to project control as a default. The second was at the corner of the yard near the lean-to, angled away from the bikes positioned toward the side of the house. They knew the layout. The gray sedan from last night had not been surveillance. It had been measurement. "Mr. Briggs," the first man said, "I think you understand the situation." "I understand you're trespassing," Hank said. "I understand you've been on the phone with federal contacts. Whatever timeline they've given you, I'd revise it downward, significantly. Hank said nothing. The evidence your late wife compiled was built on documents she had no legal right to access, the man said, obtained in violation of confidentiality statutes. Any competent attorney dismantles it in a preliminary hearing. What it will do between now and that hearing is put everyone in this house into a situation that, where's Slate, Hank said. A beat, one beat only. The composed expression recalibrated by a fraction. The fraction that meant the question had landed somewhere unexpected. That's not a conversation for where is he? Not louder, harder. The difference between volume and force is the difference between making noise and meaning it. From inside the house, Ethan heard Garrett's voice rapid and low from the back room, on the phone again. And then he heard something else. He'd been tracking it at the edge of awareness for 90 seconds, growing from the north, coming down Route 87, not vehicles from Slate's network. A different sound, multiple sources. The synchronized rumble he had heard once before on a rain-soaked highway, arriving through a storm when he had been lying on wet gravel looking up at a buzzing yellow streetlight. The man at the gate heard it too. His composure shifted again. Another fraction. This time it didn't fully return to where it had been. 47 Harley-Davidson motorcycles came down the county road and turned into the ranch entrance. They came in a formation that was not aggressive in any theatrical sense. No acceleration, no display, but which occupied the space with a totality that made display unnecessary. They parked in a line across the yard entrance, and the riders dismounted and stood beside their bikes and said nothing. The nothing they said had the weight of men who had ridden through the night from chapters spread across the region and were not in a hurry and were not leaving. Ethan had not seen most of these men before. Some he recognized, older ones, the kind of worn-in that comes from decades rather than years. The posture of people who had built their lives around a particular set of obligations and had stopped questioning whether those obligations were worth it a long time ago because the questioning itself was no longer the point. Earl Dawson was among them, gray-bearded, standing beside his bike with his arms loose at his sides, looking at the yard with the patience of a man who had seen this sequence play out before and knew how it ended. Full table, Hank had said 2 days ago in that room. This was the full table. The man at the gate looked at the line of bikes and the line of riders and performed his own calculation. Ethan watched him do it and watched it come back with an answer the man did not like. This changes nothing about the legal. Get off my property, Hank said, not loud. The quietness of absolute commitment, which carries its own kind of volume, that volume itself cannot replicate. A long moment. The second man near the lean-to had shifted his weight, from forward to back, the posture of a decision that had already been made. The man at the gate looked at Hank for a count of 5. Then he looked past Hank at the house, scanning in the pattern of a man looking for something he expected to be visible and couldn't locate, looking for the box, looking for Rosie. Something moved in Ethan's chest, not fear, something hotter and more directional than fear. He kept his arm around Rosie's shoulders, kept his position in the hallway, kept his breathing controlled. The man at the gate made a decision. It showed in his shoulders before it showed in his face. He looked at the riders one final time. Then he turned and walked to the vehicle, and the second man followed, and the vehicle started and pulled out of the ranch entrance and moved south on the county road past the line of parked bikes and disappeared. Nobody moved for 30 seconds, then slayed from the side door. The sedan from last night is at the 241 junction. Driver hasn't moved. It'll move, said Earl Dawson from the yard, the certainty of someone who had seen this specific sequence before. They made the calculation. They'll regroup. How long before they come back differently? Darnell said. Depends on Slate, Hank said. He had come back inside. The shotgun was lowered. His face had returned to its operational stillness. But underneath it now was a temperature Ethan hadn't seen before. Something older and more personal than the controlled force from the porch. The temperature of a man who has spoken a name out loud after a long time of keeping it internal and discovered that saying it changes something that cannot be unchanged. Depends on how desperate he is. He's desperate, Garrett said. He was back in the main room, camera still open on his phone. I got the sedan's plates, sending them now. He looked up. My contact says 25 minutes. They move faster than expected. 25 minutes, Hank said. The data is already on the federal server, Barrett said. Dana's documentation, the cross-references, everything on the drive. It's there regardless of what happens to the physical copies. Then Slate coming back here gets him nothing, Slade said. It gets him Rosie, Ethan said. Everyone looked at him. The box is evidence. The data on the drive is evidence. But Rosie is a witness. She can identify Driscoll. She saw him at orientation with Holden. She can place him connecting Holden's office to Slate's network. He looked at Hank. If Slate is coming himself, if he's desperate enough to come himself, this location is compromised. He knows the layout. He knows the numbers. He knows we have the documentation. He paused. A second approach won't be 2 men at a gate. Hank was looking at him with the expression that Ethan was learning to read. The one that arrived when something Ethan said had already been in Hank's mind, and the fact of a 14-year-old boy saying it out loud created a complicated thing in Hank Briggs's chest that had no clean category. Earl, Hank said. Earl Dawson stepped through the door. Already know where you're going to say. The location clean. Nothing Holden touched, nothing in any county record her office ever accessed. Take Rosie. Barrett goes with you. Second copy of the drive. Hank looked at Barrett. You don't come back until I call. Barrett was already moving toward the hallway. Hank crouched down in front of Rosie. She looked at him with clear eyes. She had heard everything. She was 6 years old and she had heard everything, and her expression was the expression of someone who is afraid and has decided not to be governed by it. You go with Earl, Hank said. You know Earl. I know Earl, she said. You take Ranger. You stay put until I call. Okay. You did exactly right, he said. With the box. Everything your mom asked you to do. Exactly right. She looked at him for a moment. Then she put her arms around his neck and held on for 3 seconds and let go and stood up and looked at Ethan. Come back, she said. Yeah, Ethan said. We will. She nodded, took Ranger's collar, followed Earl out the back without looking back because looking back was not something Rosie Briggs did when she had decided where she was going. Ethan stood at the table with the folder in his hands and watched through the window as Earl's bike and 2 others moved out through the back trade quiet. No lights into the flat Texas scrubland where the county road couldn't see them. 25 minutes. He looked at Hank. What do I do? Hank looked at him steadily. You stay close to me. You don't open any door you haven't checked the other side of first. He held Ethan's gaze. And if something comes through a door you haven't checked, you be exactly what you were at that bus stop. Ethan nodded. You know what that cost you, Hank said. Yeah. You'd do it again. It wasn't a question, but Ethan answered it. Yeah, he said, I would. Something moved across Hank's face. The compression near the eyes that lived in the territory adjacent to a smile and had its own meaning that Ethan was beginning to understand. They came back at dusk, not 2 vehicles, 6, and Warren Slate was in the 4th one. Garrett's federal contact confirmed it 13 minutes before they turned onto the county road. A name attached to a plate attached to a man who had been careful for 9 years and was not being careful anymore, which was the most dangerous version of him. Slate was lean, mid-50s, the kind of careful grooming that understood appearance as a form of argument. He wore a jacket that cost more than 3 months of Marlene Shaw's salary. He stood in the ranch yard with federal vehicles arriving from the north and 47 Iron Cross riders holding the entrance and looked at the house with the expression of a man calculating whether there was still a version of this that worked in his favor. There wasn't. Federal prosecutor Ren Castillo stepped forward from the line of vehicles. She was smaller than most people in the yard and had the bearing of someone who had spent years being the smallest person in rooms and had developed a specific and permanent relationship with that fact. She read Warren Slate his rights in the cold dusk air of a Texas ranch yard in a voice that was clear and carried no drama, because drama was for people who needed the moment to feel larger than it was, and Ren Castillo did not need that. Slate looked at Hank once more before the federal agents moved him. It was not a threatening look. It was the look of a man trying to understand where he had miscalculated, running the sequence backward, looking for the variable he had missed. He found it in the house in the hallway in the question that nobody else had thought to ask. Has anyone searched her room? Hank looked back at him and said nothing. There was nothing that needed to be said that the situation hadn't already said with more precision than language allowed. Patrice Holden was arrested at her county office 40 minutes later. The other names in Dana's documentation, the judges, the state representative, the network across 2 counties, those arrests happened over the following 72 hours. Each one a consequence of the sequence Dana Briggs had set in motion from the inside alone, afraid building something that outlasted her by 18 months and arrived exactly when it needed to. Driscoll was picked up at a truck stop outside Lubbock 2 days later. He didn't resist. Garrett said that was how men like that operated. They held firm until the structure above them collapsed, and then they had nothing left to hold. That night, after the federal vehicles were gone and the yard was quiet and the 47 bikes had rolled back out onto the county road, heading to wherever they'd come from, Ethan sat on the porch in the cold and looked at the stars. The sky out here was enormous, not the compressed version he'd known in cities with its narrow band of visible dark. The full version. The one that required flat land and distance from human things to reveal itself. The kind of sky that Martha Calloway had been thinking of when she mentioned the telescope in the backyard. The kind that required the right window and the right orientation to find. Hank came out and sat in the other chair. He had 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Ethan without comment. They sat in the dark and looked at the sky. Castillo wants a formal statement, Hank said. From you. Your account of Tuesday night is a direct link in the evidentiary chain. Connects Slate's operational people to a specific date and location that cross-references with Dana's documentation. Okay, Ethan said. It'll mean hearings, possibly testimony if it goes to trial. Okay. Hank looked at him. You understand what that means. Months, possibly longer. Ethan looked at the stars. I understand. Before Hank could continue, a federal agent stepped up onto the porch, the one who had been coordinating with Garrett throughout the evening. He looked at Ethan and asked if he had a moment. Ethan stood up and the agent opened a tablet. On the screen was an image captured from Dana's USB drive, a coordination record from Patrice Holden's office, a list of case transfers with notations beside each one. The agent scrolled until he found it. Ethan's name. Ethan Rowe, transfer authorization dated 8 months ago, and beside his name in a column labeled coordination notes a reference code that matched the transaction format in the rest of Dana's documentation. This code, the agent said, appears throughout the records Dana Briggs compiled. It marks case transfers that were coordinated outside normal placement channels, transfers that were requested by the independent placement consultant. He looked at Ethan. By Slate. Ethan looked at his name on the screen. You weren't transferred to this county by routine administrative process, the agent said. Your transfer was requested, specifically, by name. The agent went back inside. The porch was quiet. Ethan stood at the railing and looked at the yard, at the bikes under the lean-to, at the amber light above the workshop door. He had run across a highway for a girl in a yellow slicker and lost the only future he'd ever let himself want. He had spent 3 days in a place he didn't know the name of trying to understand a situation he'd only seen the edge of. And the whole time from the moment Driscoll's phone had buzzed on the seat of a white cargo van heading south. The shape of it had been the same. He had not arrived here by accident. He had not been at that bus stop by coincidence. He had been placed there named and requested by a man who needed him accessible. And Rosie with her yellow slicker, and her engine parts, and her box that she had kept for 18 months without knowing why. Rosie, who had been dragged toward the same van on the same night, who had kicked and pulled and made a sound at a frequency that had cut through the rain and the highway noise and landed precisely in the part of Ethan Rowe that recognized it. He had not saved Rosie. Rosie had saved him by being there, by kicking, by making a sound that reached him, by pulling Iron Cross MC to a gravel pull-off on Route 87 on the one night when all of it had come together. If Rosie had not been there, Driscoll would have had a clean operation. A 14-year-old boy disappearing from a bus stop in a rainstorm, transferred to a county and then gone, listed eventually as a runaway the same as 11 others. 2 children had saved each other in the rain without knowing that was what was happening. He went back to his chair and sat down. Hank looked at him and waited. He requested me, Ethan said. By name, Slate requested my transfer to this county. I know, Hank said. My contact confirmed it while you were inside. Ethan looked at the sky. He thought about the telescope in the Calloway's backyard, the morning light through an east-facing window, the way Martha had remembered in passing that he liked astronomy. He pressed his fingers to the outside pocket of his jacket. The paper's still there, still the same shape, still the document of a future that had been real once and was something else now. A long quiet. The coffee was hot. The night was very cold and very clear. Marlene Shaw calls this afternoon, Hank said. Ethan waited. The circumstances of your case are under review. Given Holden's arrest, every placement she managed for 9 years is being re-examined. The adoption timeline is one of them. He paused. She said it could be reopened. Ethan looked at his coffee. She said that, he said. She did. He didn't say anything for a while. He looked at the sky and thought about 12 years and 11 homes and the arithmetic of wanting something so hard that the wanting itself became a kind of vulnerability. He thought about the papers in his outside pocket and why he'd moved them from the inside on the first night and couldn't fully explain it at the time. I don't think I want to anymore, he said. He said it quietly. Not with grief, or not only with grief, more with the slower recognition of someone understanding that wanting a thing and needing a thing are not the same equation. The version of him who had sat on a cold bench with adoption papers against his chest and checked the bus app 47 times had existed for specific reasons. What the last 4 days had done to those reasons was not erasure. It was something more like resolution. The way a calculation resolves when all the variables are finally known. The Callaways were good people. The telescope was real. Martha, remembering that he liked astronomy, was real and true, and had cost her nothing to do, which made it more valuable, not less. All of it was real. But it belonged to someone who needed rescuing from a bus stop. And he was beginning to understand that he was not that person anymore. He had not been that person since the moment he'd stood up from a cold bench and run. Hank was quiet for long enough that the silence had its own shape. You're not asking for anything, Hank said finally. You're telling me something. There's a difference. Ethan looked at him. I don't know what I'm asking for, Ethan said. I know, Hank said. That's okay too. He picked up his coffee and looked at the yard, at the bikes under the lean-to, at the light above the workshop door burning amber in the dark. For the first time in 18 months, Hank Briggs sat on the porch of the house he'd built and did not feel the room behind him sitting in the dark like a debt he couldn't pay. Dana's room, the door he hadn't opened since the funeral, except twice briefly for things Rosie needed. The room where a woman had been afraid and had documented her fear with the thoroughness of someone who understood that fear, without documentation, was just noise that disappeared when the person making it was gone. She had been smarter than Slate had ever given her credit for. Hank had known that. He had always known that. But knowing something and being able to say it out loud in the open air to another person in the present tense was not the same thing. Nothing was the same until it was said. He thought about the box on the table, the handwriting on 3 sheets of white paper, the specific care of it. She had kept Rosie close because she loved her, and because Rosie was the one person Slate would never think to search. You didn't look at a 6-year-old for evidence. You didn't consider what a child might be quietly keeping without understanding why. She had known what she was doing, right up until the end she had known. He pressed his hand once flat on the arm of his chair. Then he picked up his coffee. There's a bed, he said, in the back, the room next to Rosie's. It's been a storage room, but there's a frame in it, and Barrett can get a mattress sorted in the morning. He looked at the yard. No obligation attached to it, no timeline. You figure out what you want when you want it. Ethan looked at the papers in his pocket. He didn't take them out. He pressed his hand once to the outside of his jacket, felt the rectangle of them. Still there, still the same shape, still the document of a future that had been real and was now something else entirely. And the something else was not worse. It was just different in ways he was still learning to name. He moved his hand away. The tires of a vehicle crunched slowly on the county road out front. Both of them registered it. Hank's posture shifted slightly. Then the sound continued north without slowing, and the night was quiet again. A long moment. Rosie asked me this morning if I was staying, Ethan said. I know, Hank said. She told me. What did you tell her? I told her it was your call. Ethan looked at the sky for a long time. long enough that the cold settled fully into his hands and the back of his neck. The honest cold of a November night in Texas that did not apologize for what it was or soften itself for anyone standing in it. "Okay," he said. Hank looked at him. "Okay," Ethan said again, and this time the word carried a different weight. Not the okay of someone accepting a situation, not the okay of someone running numbers and finding no better alternative. The okay of someone making a choice. The weight of agency which Ethan Rowe had had very little of in 14 years and was learning the feel of now. In both hands, on a porch in the dark, under the full Texas sky. Hank picked up his coffee, drank, said nothing. That was the right response. Ethan was beginning to understand that Hank Briggs' silences were not absences. They were a form of presence, the kind that didn't require performance or noise, that existed solidly in the space between words and didn't need the words to hold it up. The kind of presence that said, "I heard you and I am here, and that is enough for right now." 6 months later, on a bright September morning in a county courthouse in Amarillo, a judge signed the guardianship papers. The hearing took 11 minutes. Castillo had submitted a letter. Marlene Shaw had submitted a letter. The review board that had spent 4 months re-examining every placement in Patrice Holden's network had submitted a comprehensive report. It named 11 children who had not been runaways. 3 of them were found in the months following Slate's arrest. The others remained open cases. The report noted in its conclusions that the evidence compiled by Dana Briggs had been the single most significant contribution to the federal prosecution's case. It named her by name. It used the word courageous. Ethan sat in the courtroom in a collared shirt that Darnell had driven him to buy in Amarillo 3 days prior in a transaction that involved Darnell standing in the men's section with the expression of a man entirely outside his operational context, but committed to completing the mission regardless, and Ethan selecting the most functional option available, and Darnell paying without being asked, and neither of them discussing it on the drive back. The silence on that drive had been the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't need filling. Outside the courthouse, the morning was the yellow gold of early September in Texas, the summer's heat softening towards something more livable. The sky, the hard, clear blue of a season turning. 47 Harleys were parked along the courthouse block. The riders stood beside their bikes. Earl Dawson near the front, Barrett with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the courthouse steps. Slade with the compass rose on his right forearm, catching the morning light in a way that made it look deliberate. Darnell with his arms crossed, and his face in the expression it always wore, which Ethan now understood meant he was paying full attention to everything and processing most of it without comment. Garrett with his thermos and his gray beard and his tablet tucked under his arm. They stood there and said nothing when Hank and Ethan came down the steps. No noise, no display. They simply stood in the morning light with their leather cuts and their coffee cups and their scarred hands and their patient weathered faces, and the standing itself was the thing. The presence that didn't need to announce itself because it had already done what presence was for. It had already shown up in the rain on a Tuesday night. It had already been there when it mattered. Everything after that was just continuation. Ren Castillo was there as well. She had come not in any official capacity, but because she had submitted a letter and then had decided that letters were not sufficient and that some things required your physical presence to be fully said. She shook Hank's hand. Then she looked at Ethan. "The testimony you gave," she said, "was the clearest account I've heard in 20 years of federal prosecution. You said what you saw and nothing more and nothing less. That's rarer than it should be." Ethan looked at her. Dana Briggs did the hard part. Castillo looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once with the economy of someone who recognized a true thing and didn't need to ornament it, and went back to her vehicle. An agent from the task force stopped Ethan on the steps as well. The same one who had shown him the tablet screen on the night of Slate's arrest. He said the case had moved to trial and they'd be in touch about scheduling. He said Dana Briggs' documentation had expanded the original warrant to include 6 additional names that the task force had been unable to confirm for 2 years. He said it quietly, and he said it to Ethan, not to Hank, because Ethan was the one who had asked the question. "Has anyone searched her room?" That question had changed the shape of what followed. That was all he said. Then he went back to his vehicle. Rosie was sitting on Earl Dawson's gas tank eating a granola bar. When she saw Ethan come down the steps, she climbed down and walked over and stood in front of him and looked at him with the direct, unfiltered attention that had read him accurately every single time since a rain-soaked diner 6 months ago on a dark Tuesday night. "So you're staying," she said. Not a question. "Yeah," Ethan said, "I'm staying." She nodded once, the solemn judicial nod of a child who has accepted an answer and found it satisfactory. Then she held out the other half of the granola bar. He took it. She looked at him for another moment with those clear eyes that had seen more than they should have, and processed it all with a precision that still caught him off guard. "Dogs are better judges than people," she said. "Yeah," he said, "you've mentioned that." "It's still true," she said with the patience of someone who doesn't expect the obvious to be obvious to everyone on the first pass, and walked back toward Earl's bike. Ranger appeared from somewhere around the parked Harleys and sat on Ethan's feet, his established position when the situation called for his anchoring presence. Ethan looked down at the dog, then up at the 47 riders along the courthouse block, then at Hank beside him, who was looking at the morning with the expression of a man who has paid a very high price for something and is standing on the other side of the payment looking at what it bought. Not equal. The price was too high for equality. Dana Briggs was still gone, and that fact did not get smaller. It would not get smaller. There was no version of the morning in which it was smaller. But what was here was real. Built from the wreckage of things that had broken the way the best things are built, because broken things that survive the breaking know what they're made of in a way that whole things never have to learn. Ethan Rowe had run across a highway for a girl in a yellow slicker and lost the only future he'd ever let himself want badly enough to be afraid of losing. What he'd found instead was not a replacement. It was not a consolation. It was its own thing, entirely built out of the specific wreckage of a Tuesday night in November, shaped by people who had chosen to stay in the middle of it when they could have walked away. He pressed his hand once to the outside pocket of his jacket, felt the papers there, then moved his hand away. He had no telescope. He had no morning light through an east-facing window. He had papers in an outside pocket that said something official about where he belonged. He didn't need the papers to know. The granola bar wrapper went into his pocket. He walked to where the bikes were waiting in the September morning light. The engines started one by one. From 1 to 47, the sound built in the way that a sound becomes something beyond itself when enough people make it together and mean it. Not just a sound anymore. A fact. The kind that didn't need words because it was already the thing the words were pointing at. Everything that had been broken was not fixed. It was never going to be fixed. That was not how broken things worked. But it was held by hands that knew the weight of it, by people who had chosen each of them in their own time and for their own reasons to stay. And in the end, under the blue September sky of a Texas morning, with 47 engines turning over, and a 6-year-old girl riding on Earl Dawson's gas tank, eating the last of her granola bar with a boy sitting on his feet and a man with a scar on his jaw standing beside him, looking at the road ahead, that was the only math that mattered.